What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch Fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down must-start wide receivers for Week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Keep in mind, during today's video, we are not going over obvious must-start wide receivers like Tyreek Hill or Justin Jefferson. We're kind of looking at players who you might be second-guessing, players that have really good overall matchups, or players that are just kind of overall lower-tier wide receivers who I think are going to perform very well in Week 17. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, I know I said I wasn't going to be going over obvious must-start players at the receiver position, but I just have to mention that CeeDEE Lamb is 100% by definition a must-start player here in Week 17. Whatever you do, if you own CeeDEE Lamb, do not bench him for anyone. I mean, he went absolutely wild last week against the Philadelphia Eagles with 34 fantasy points, his second highest total on the season. So with those 2 touchdowns, 120 receiving yards off of 10 receptions, fresh in your mind, I don't think you would be benching him anyways. But the Tennessee Titans are the worst team in the entire NFL from a fantasy perspective against the wide receiver position. CeeDEE Lamb needs to be in your lineup no matter what as we approach Week 17. Okay, I know what you're saying. We just said we aren't going over obvious must-starts, and I talked about CeeDEE Lamb. Now I'm talking about Davante Adams. But Davante Adams, 10 or less fantasy points in his last 3 matchups, 6.8 or less fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, at least 9 targets in his last 2 games. That's 18 total targets in his last 2 games, just 6 receptions. It's been kind of a struggle the past 2 weeks, for the Raiders passing game as a whole, and for Davante Adams. We loved Adams last week. Pittsburgh Steelers have played awful against opposing wide receivers, but it was a really weird, holiday weekend with a lot of bad weather, a lot of cold, frigid temperatures, and a lot of these games and their game scripts were impacted by the weather. On top of that, this week, with all the struggles we've seen out of the Raiders as of late, Davante Adams gets the San Francisco 49ers. The Raiders get the San Francisco 49ers, arguably the best defense in the league. But if you guys have watched the must-start videos for the last 2 weeks, we have targeted the San Francisco 49ers secondary in the must-start videos. And for the most part, it's paid off. We liked Terry McLaurin last week. We liked JAHAN Dotson going into the week. The week before, we liked DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett going up against the Niners. And ultimately, DK Metcalf played very well 2 weeks ago. Tyler Lockett a little bit iffy, but last week, the Commanders wide receivers played really well against the Niners. The thing that happens from a fantasy perspective is the Niners are so good against the run, so good in the first half of the game, have a great pass rush, that what they do is they force opposing teams to throw the football. And I really think the Raiders, who have struggled in the last 2 weeks or so to throw the football, will get it together here in Week 17. Don't get me wrong. I think the Niners are going to win this game. I definitely think they will be the better team in this matchup. But I think the Raiders will be playing from behind. Davante Adams is playing against a secondary that is still the weakest part of this Niners defense. And I think the Raiders know in a must-win game to keep their playoff hopes and really their playoff dreams alive, that Davante Adams has to be a part of this game plan. So I actually like Davante Adams a lot from a fantasy perspective. And if you own Adams, if you're in the fantasy championship, if you're fighting for 3rd place, if you're fighting for your toilet bowl championship, whatever it is, I do think that Adams should be in your lineup moving into Week 17. All right, next up on the list, we've got Chris Godwin. Godwin really should be looked at as a must-start on a weekly basis. I mean, in a full PPR league, what more do you want out of Chris Godwin? Since his return from injury in Week 4, he has given you double-digit fantasy points every single week, 10.4 or more fantasy points every week with a ceiling of 29 fantasy points. He's coming off of a 14.3 performance against the Cardinals last week. 10 targets, 8 receptions, 63 receiving yards. Godwin has just been, a very productive receiver. I know he missed 2 games, didn't play the best game overall in week 1, but he got hurt, right? So at the end of the day, Godwin has been extremely productive on the year. He's probably not going to hit 1,000 yards, but really from a fantasy perspective and full PPR release, he's played very well. Gets the Carolina Panthers here in week 17. The nice thing with having Mike Evans on the field, although Evans' production has gone way down and really has been a player we've been avoiding from a fantasy perspective, opposing defenses still apply a lot of their defensive pressure on Mike Evans in terms of their secondary, which allows Chris Godwin to do a little bit more. So I think Chris Godwin going up against the Carolina Panthers is just a very solid start. A great wide receiver too, a really nice flex option for you guys moving into week 17. All right, next on the list, we've got DeVonta Smith going up against the Saints. Listen, at the end of the day, DeVonta Smith, a player I loved in the offseason, a player I begged you guys to draft, started the year with a 0-point performance against the Detroit Lions. But overall, outside of week 1 against the Lions and outside of 4 other matchups on the season, he has given me double digits every single week. And as of late, he has looked great since week 13, 17 or more fantasy points in all his matchups. He has looked great the last 4 weeks. He has been a bona fide must start on a weekly basis. He's had 8 or more targets in every game since week 10. He's had 8 or more targets in every game since week 8 if you exclude week 9 against the Houston Texans. I was a little bit worried last week, I'm not going to lie to you guys, because I was not sure what the chemistry between Gardner Minshew and DeVonta Smith was going to look like in comparison to Hurts to Smith. At the end of the day, it did not matter. I mean, DeVonta Smith had his best fantasy performance of the season against the Dallas Cowboys defense with a backup quarterback, playing 31.3 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 113 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. At this point in the season, I do not care who DeVonta Smith is playing. I do not care who the quarterback is. The upside is far too high. DeVonta Smith is the best boomer bust wide receiver option you can have in your lineup on a weekly basis. And at the end of the day, as of late, he has been booming. He is a great option for you guys moving into week 17 of the season. All right, last week we talked a lot about Jerry Jeudy. I really liked him against the Rams. He finished the day with 17.7 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 receptions, and 117 receiving yards. Since his return from injury, he's given you 10 or more fantasy points in every game he's played in since week 7. He's given you 10 or more fantasy points. He's been the better receiving option with a higher ceiling when it comes to the Denver Broncos' abysmal offense. The good thing with the Broncos, at least, is that they are constantly playing from behind. He gets the Kansas City Chiefs this week. This is a game I would imagine the Broncos will be playing from behind. And if not, maybe it looks more like what we saw in week 14 against the Chiefs, where Jeudy finished the day with 33.3 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns, 73 receiving yards. Ultimately, Jeudy, a solid option against a Chiefs secondary that is allowing a lot of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I think Courtland Sutton's an okay start too, but his ceiling is just not high. Sutton's going to get you 11 or 12 points, especially if he doesn't score. His ceiling is just not high whatsoever. Jerry Jeudy is the player who is going to get more receptions, more yardage, and hopefully a score or 2. At the end of the day, Jerry Jeudy, just a really solid start in a game that does not matter for the Broncos, but does matter for the Chiefs. And once again, in these division rival games, I expect the Broncos to keep this thing as competitive as they possibly can. So Jeudy, a solid start moving into week 17. All right, next up on the list, I've got Christian Watson, who at the moment is dealing with a hip injury. He's considered day-to-day, so we have a little bit of an asterisk here. If you own Christian Watson, just keep an eye on him. Suffered an injury last week, had to exit that game against the Dolphins early, but ultimately he was on a nice pace. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 49 receiving yards, 10 fantasy points in full PPR. Obviously, Watson came back to earth in week 15 against the Rams with 8.6 fantasy points, but the previous 4 weeks he gave you 21 or more fantasy points in 4 straight matchups. The thing that I liked from what I saw between Aaron Rodgers and Watson against the Dolphins is that Rodgers, it feels like he knows Watson is a playmaker. He kept trying to give Watson opportunity after opportunity to make something happen. 8 targets, 6 receptions. Watson was, responding very well to most of those opportunities. So week 17, the Minnesota Vikings, one of the worst secondaries in all of fantasy football. Going into week 16, they have allowed the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They just got torched by the New York Giants wide receivers. Isaiah Hodgins, Richie James, Darius Slayton just had a field day against this Vikings secondary. If Christian Watson is playing, he is a great flex option and even a player you can consider in your wide receiver 2 spot moving into the week. If he does not play, keep an eye on Allen Lazard. Keep an eye on Romeo Doubs. Romeo Doubs just rostered 51% of leagues. Could see some nice usage if you're absolutely desperate. Keep an eye on Randall Cobb. You never know. Allen Lazard is rostered in 84% of leagues, but if you own Lazard, this could be a week where he kind of gets back to what we saw out of him earlier in the season and before Christian Watson really came onto the scene. So at the end of the day, if Watson is healthy and good to go, play him. If he's not, play another Packers receiver, more than likely, because this Minnesota Vikings secondary is god awful. And this is a very important game for both the Packers and the Vikings as we move in to week 17. All right, last on the list, I've got Jahan Dotson going up against the Cleveland Browns. Dotson's had 16 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts, 19.6 fantasy points against the San Francisco 49ers in week 16, 6 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a touchdown for Dotson. Listen, I think at the end of the day, Terry McLaurin is worth consideration, and I won't be surprised if Curtis Samuel has a nice stat line as well. The Browns have played pretty well against opposing wide receivers, but at the end of the day, a must-win game for the Washington Commanders. The Cleveland Browns were eliminated from playoff contention last week, but at the end of the day, this is still a team trying to find their identity. I would imagine they are going to keep this game as competitive as possible. I really like the Washington Commanders going in to this weekend offensively, whether Taylor Heineke or Carson Wentz is the starting quarterback. Both of them have good chemistry with Jahan Dotson. I just think he's a very solid, high ceiling player to get you hopefully 16 or more fantasy points like he's done in the last 3 weeks. A touchdown in his last 3 games. I just think Dotson is a really good start in the flex moving in to week 17. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. And be on the lookout for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. I would love to have you there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.